From UFC fighters not being given proper salaries, to the organization monetizing their likeness without giving any compensation, here's how the UFC manipulates and mistreats its fighters. Now, it's got to be said, the fighters don't even get paid properly. In 2022, it was reported that the average UFC fighter makes around $150,000. And while that number might seem like a lot, keep in mind that when compared to other athletes, it's almost nothing. The average basketball player, for example, can rake in as much dough as $7.5 million per season, with soccer players making around $4 million each year. When you consider how UFC fighters are risking their lives with each and every fight, it makes the small amount of cash they're given in return feel that much smaller. To make matters worse, UFC president Dana White doesn't have an issue with this at all. Anytime the discussion of fighter pay crops up, Dana's quick to shut it down. In fact, he once even said that fighters are paid what they're supposed to get paid.
Never gonna happen while I'm here. Believe me, these guys get paid what they're supposed to get paid.
In his mind, boxing overpaid its fighters, which led to a decline in the sport's popularity.
Boxing has absolutely been destroyed because of money and all the things that go on.
And this was around the same time the UFC started rising. While it's got to be said that elite fighters do well for themselves, a lot of the lesser-known fighters in the UFC struggle to reach even the average income in the US. Because they're not as famous, they struggle to leave their mark and are told not to complain. It's a terrible system that totally leads to mistreatment. And get this, they can't even do much about it. That's because the UFC requires that fighters sign up as independent contractors. Now you might be wondering, what does that even mean? Well, as it turns out, in the UFC, fighters aren't considered employees of the organization. Instead, by signing up as independent contractors, they're basically like lone wolves. Fighters are on their own when it comes to taxes, health insurance, and all the expenses related to their work. Tough, right? In fact, the only time health insurance is provided to fighters is when they're injured in a bout or while preparing for one. But that's not all. As independent contractors, fighters don't get the fancy stuff that comes with being an employee. No paid time off, no sick leave, and no sweet retirement benefits. And this has some serious consequences for the fighters. Since they're not considered employees, the UFC doesn't have to cough up cash for any of the things I just talked about. It leads to the organization saving a truckload of money. But obviously, it's total mistreatment when it comes to the fighters. And let's be real, this whole thing deserves to be called out for being downright slimy. And for what it's worth, fighters and advocates have raised their voices in the past. After all, these warriors risk it all every time they step into the octagon, and they should be treated right, like employees with all the benefits and protections they deserve. The current system also makes it so. The fighters aren't given any of the protections awarded to employees under labor laws. For instance, they're not allowed to unionize. With a union, they could negotiate better pay, benefits, and working conditions. Right now, the UFC holds all the cards in those talks, and we all know they care more about their profits than anything else. And it's clear they don't want to give up control no matter what. In fact, even the idea of unionization outright terrifies Dana. He's afraid that allowing unionization could open the door to a whole bunch of legal challenges. Another reason the UFC is running scared is that a union would give fighters more bargaining power. But nope, the UFC just wants them to be at their mercy. But you know what? It's not all on the UFC. Unionization is a tough sell in the world of MMA. This sport is all about individual competition, and some fighters are hesitant to join forces in a collective unit. This is where the manipulation comes in. By giving the fighters at the top better pay, the organization makes it so their biggest fishes never feel the need to worry about low pay or employee rights. That's because they're gonna end up all right either way. And in the end, it's the less famous fighters that struggle to stay afloat, despite the organization pulling in millions upon millions of dollars. It's clear the UFC has a ton of power and influence in the industry, making it a real uphill battle. And get this, there isn't even a ton of job security for the fighters in the UFC. Losing a fight ain't just a punch to your ego, it could be a KO to your bank account. Yeah, it's a tough pill to swallow. But when fighters sign with the UFC, they're committing to fight for a certain period and a specific number of bouts. It's like a 3 or 4 fight deal over a year or two. But here's the twist. Losing any of those fights can totally change the contract game. Fighters put their lives and well-being on the line in that octagon, and you'd think the least the UFC could do is stick to their word, right? But unfortunately, that's not how they roll. In fact, the UFC can terminate contracts for various reasons. I mean, it's not just about losing fights. They can boot fighters for failing a drug test, or even for saying something negative about the organization. So why does the UFC play contract hardball? Well, it's all about having control over their roster and making sure they have the best fighters. They want to keep the UFC brand strong. They're ready to do whatever it takes to achieve that. And speaking of the drug tests, I've got to talk about how intrusive they can be. We all know athletes get tested for drugs, but the UFC takes it to a whole new level with their year-round testing program. So the UFC teamed up with the US Anti-Doping Agency to make sure their fighters stay squeaky clean. And when I say clean, I mean spotless. These fighters get hit with random drug tests all year long. Random means they can be tested anywhere, anytime, and for any reason. Like seriously, some fighters have been tested on vacation or even while on a grocery run. Fighters have to inform USADA of their daily regular schedule, and any changes have to be reported to them. It's like they treat you like you're a criminal on the run. Now you might be wondering, why the heck is the UFC so strict about drug testing? Well, they want to keep this sport clean and fair. Fighters using performance-enhancing drugs? Nah, not on their watch. It gives them an unfair advantage over those who play by the rules, and that's not what the UFC is about. In fact, they've got a zero-tolerance policy when it comes to PEDs. Fighters caught using them might as well say goodbye to their hard-earned cash, face hefty fines, serve suspensions, and they could even lose their precious titles. And despite all these restrictions and hurdles, in the end, the organization gets to reap most of the rewards. That's because the UFC has the unrestricted right to exploit a fighter's name. When fighters sign with the UFC, they're also signing away their name and likeness to the organization. And it's about as bad as it sounds. You're making a deal with the devil. Basically, the UFC can use their names and faces for any marketing and promotion purposes they please. That might sound like a good deal at first. After all, it's free, right? But hold on, there's more. The catch is that the UFC can use their names and likenesses without paying them a single penny. Yup, you heard that right. Zero compensation. If the UFC wants to put a fighter's mug on a giant billboard, use their name in a TV commercial, or even create a video game featuring them, they can do it all without taking any damage to their own wallets. And that's not even the end of it. See, it isn't just about promotional stuff, it's a roller coaster of exploitation. The UFC can also use their names and faces for broadcasts, streaming events, merchandise sales, and who knows what else. I mean, they're practically turning fighters into walking billboards. And it's not cool, man. It's got to be said that a lot of fighters put a ton of time and effort into creating their reputation. It's hard enough to stand out nowadays, especially with so many great names out there. So it must really sting to have all the rewards of your hard work go straight to the UFC. I mean, not being able to monetize your own image kind of seems harsh, doesn't it? But that's just one of the many ways. The UFC has continued to manipulate its fighters, taking away perks and rights from them for the sake of their own profit margins. So from the organization monetizing their likeness without giving any compensation, to UFC fighters not being given proper salaries, that was how the UFC manipulates and mistreats its fighters.